Hello, and welcome to the latest installment of the Progressives for Immigration Reform podcast. And today I'm really excited because we have a fantastic guest. His name is Dr. Ron Hira. He's with the College of Arts and Sciences at Howard University. And for the past 15 years, he has been researching the H1B Visa program. And he has testified before Congress on numerous occasions. And he has written research articles for academia as well as for the press and media. Ron, it's great to have you here today.
Thanks for having me on.
And the H1B visa program is certainly of interest to us here at Progressives for Immigration Reform, largely because of its impact and the consequences it has for U.S. workers, particularly tech workers. And for those who might not be aware of what the program is, it was a program that was created as part of the Immigration Act of 1990, and it allows employers to hire foreign workers on a temporary basis for jobs that require specialized skills and knowledge. And to kind of start things off with, Ron, how does someone go from living in a foreign country and then coming here to the U.S. to work under the H1B visa program?
Sure. So it's it's what we would call a skilled guest worker program. It's employer driven. So the employer has to sponsor the worker for the H1B. Typically, not typically, but by law, the threshold is it's an occupation that typically requires a bachelor's degree. So it could be anything from computing to accounting to journalism, any occupation, white collar occupation that you can think of. And then the worker themselves has to have at least a bachelor's degree or equivalent experience in that area in order to qualify. So the threshold really isn't all that high, and there's a wide variety of occupations.
So it's really, there's a real subjective quality to this program, isn't there? It isn't like a, objective in terms of when we're looking for someone with specialized skills and knowledge, we're expecting someone to have a PhD in a specific field.
Yeah, I think that the terminology is misleading in a lot of ways. There's really nothing particularly specialized about what you need to have in order to qualify for an H1B program. It's really up to the employer to say, we want to have this H1B, and for the H1B to meet that sort of minimum threshold. And that minimum threshold, like I said, isn't very high. It's a bachelor's degree, and then the occupation typically would be a white-collar occupation.
So what does the employer do to, you mentioned application, and I've heard the term LCA, labor conditional application used. So how does an employer go from, wow, I think I have a position I'd like to fill with a foreign worker, to realizing that?
It's actually, on the surface, it appears like they have to do a lot and that it's difficult, and you'll hear employers complain about it. In reality, it's extremely easy. In fact, way too easy for an employer to get one of these. But basically what they have to say is, I have this position I potentially want to fill. They go to the Labor Department. They fill out an electronic application and without even a worker identified, and they just say, we're going to pay so much, and this is the occupation, this is the geographic location, this is the skill level that we expect. And then once almost all of those get approved, 99.5% of the LCA is a labor condition application. So Labor Department, and it's been called by the Labor Department's own Inspector General as just a rubber stamp. The LCA is not providing anything useful.
So about how many LCAs per year are, how many applications come into the Department of Labor a year?
It's about 1.5 million, and as I said, about
1.5 million. Okay.
Yeah, that means 1.5 million positions. Those are jobs.
So they could be maybe a position for sure. It's really the employer saying, yeah, I think, it could be pie in the sky for them.
That's correct. And then there's renewals that get put in there. But it gives you a sense of the scale. 1.5 million is about how many jobs we create each year. So it's very large, and it's concentrated, again, in the white-collar area. And so that's important to keep in mind. So this is a substantial guest worker program.
So now we're at that's the LCA, the filling out of the application. What's the next step then? How do we go from this? Here's a job that we may want to give to a foreigner to. What's the next step in that process to getting someone to the U.S.?
So once you have the LCA approved, and virtually all of them are approved, you then take it and you identify an actual worker. They could be living in the U.S., let's say as a student, or they could be living abroad. You identify that worker and you file what's called an I-129 form with the Department of Homeland Security, the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Service.
I-129 form.
Correct.
Okay. And now, so they've identified someone for that position. There's an I-129 filled out. What's the next step then?
So then you apply, the employer applies on behalf of the worker. And what they do is they file this with USCIS. Now, what's happened over the last few years is that the program has an annual cap for new workers.
And what is that annual cap, Ron?
The annual cap is 85,000 new workers per year. And 20,000 of that 85,000 is set aside for foreigners who've gotten advanced degrees. That means like a master's degree or higher, or a law degree, professional degree. 20,000 are set aside for those foreign graduates of U.S. universities.
I see. So if someone were here in the U.S., they get a master's in a STEM field, they could pretty much count on being one of that 20,000 that gets an H1B visa.
Yeah, they would first be plugged into that 20,000, and it wouldn't have to be in a STEM degree; it can be in any degree.
Okay.
And they could have earned the U.S. degree 10 years ago. They could be living back at their home. So it's not immediate graduates. It's just as long as you hold a graduate degree from one of those universities.
Oh, interesting. So what is the next step then? So we have a lot of these L29s, I-29s out there, 129s. What's the next step then?
So they file the I-129, then USCIS reviews it. And what's happened because of the 85,000 cap, and the employers really love H-1Bs because they're cheaper and they're indentured, it's been oversubscribed. So on the first day that the cap opens, which is April 1st of each year, they've been flooded with applications. And so with USCIS, and just to give you an example, last year there were 199,000 applications, I-129 petition applications for 85,000 slot, right?
So how do they go about determining which 85,000 gets to actually hold a job in the U.S.?
Yeah, so what they do is, and they don't have to do this, but they've chosen to do this, they run a lottery, a random lottery. They say each of those 199,000 have an equal chance at these 85,000 slots.
When you're bringing in people for specialized skills and knowledge, it almost seems like a lottery system works against finding the absolute best and brightest and best fits for certain positions.
Yeah, there's been some discussion about, well, why do we run a lottery? Why wouldn't we rank order it based on need, right? I mean, if we're going to bring people in as guest workers, we should at least bring in the best of that, and obviously it's oversubscribed. And there's really no good reason why we do it as a lottery. I go further. I mean, there's employers who game the system, and so there are employers who essentially run an H1B visa business models, and they're dominating and getting huge numbers. So, just make a concrete example. You might have a company like a Cognizant that says we want to get 5,000 of that 85,000, and we've got 150,000 workers in India. So we've got this huge bench in India. We don't care which 5,000 get that visa, but we figure we'll have a 1 in 3 chance. We'll put in 15,000 applications, petitions, and it doesn't matter which of the 5,000. We know we'll get 1 in 3 pretty much approved. And that squeezes out small firms that have identified one worker who they really need or want, because they only have a 1 in 3 chance. So a Cognizant, an outsourcing firm that replaces Americans, will get all the workers they want with this lottery system. Whereas those small firms that are really trying to bring in this specialized worker probably get squeezed out of the system.
So now let's take it to that next step. So Cognizant get their 5,000 petitions approved, or they win the lot, they win 5,000 petitions. That's 5,000 people that they bring in. How do they choose where they go? How does that work?
So on the petition itself, and based on the labor condition application, the prior step with the Labor Department, they've identified work sites. And if they're going to place them, and oftentimes these companies are called outsourcers, and what they're doing is they're really placing the workers at client sites, so customer sites. So they may have a client, let's say a Bank of America, or New York Life, or Disney, and they say, look, we're going to place the worker at that work site.
So Cognizant or a Tata, those aren't the end work sites locations. It'll be one of their client firms.
Yeah, these are IT services firms. They don't house them in their own office space. They're actually placing them, their labor for hire in a sense. And so depending on the client, sometimes they'll get clients to write a letter saying, yes, this worker is going to come to this work site. And so the USCIS reviews that and then approves it, and then Cognizant will place that worker at that client site. Now, it could be that project only lasts 6 months or a year, but the visa is valid for 6 years. And so you've got this valid H-1B worker, you're going to place them at the next client site. And so then you go
that gives them this ready pool of labor that's always queued up to take a job that could be held by an American.
And a lot of times they were held by Americans. There's nothing really specialized. So we use this language specialized, but in reality, the threshold, the criteria to qualify as specialized is something that is quite ordinary, and that lots and lots of Americans already have these skills.
Interesting. Barbara Ehrenreich once made the statement in her book, Nickel and Dime, there are no unskilled jobs. Mm-hmm. Every job requires a modicum of skill and experience and on-the-job kind of learning and training.
Yeah, so on a more technical level, typically the way we talk about skills, or this language of skills, and define them academically is really twofold. There's two variables that are looked at. One is the education level. So do you have an associate's degree, a bachelor's, a master's, a PhD? You're moving up sort of the skill levels. Now, whether that's true or not is a different matter, right? This is the way we sort of try to divide up or segment the labor market or skills. The other is based on wages. So the higher the wage you have, the higher skills you have.
Great. Well, now that we've covered how the program works, one of the things that when you've testified before Congress and the articles you've written, you've spent a lot of time shining a spotlight on the abuses and the abusers of the program. And that's what I'd really like to delve into now, Ron. How is this program abused? And maybe if we could start with, for instance, you were talking about one of the criteria being education level. What is the breakdown in terms of levels of education of the typical H-1B visa holder?
Yeah, so within the 65,000 or the 85,000 cap, 20,000 are set aside for advanced degree holders. But if we looked at that and focused on the 65,000 that's remaining, and that's really the core part of the program, probably about 60% have no more than a bachelor's degree.
Wow. Interesting, because I had always been under the impression that H-1B was the genius visa. Mm-hmm. We got to get that Einstein who's out there and get him here. And that's not the case.
Absolutely not. The typical H-1B worker has no more than a bachelor's degree, is earning a very low salary, which would also tell you their skill levels aren't that high. Most of them have degrees from abroad. They're not studying here, so they're not students that we've trained and are kicking out. There are people who have been working mostly in India, mm-hmm. Who are in their late 20s.
And that's kind of, it's almost a stereotype that tech workers, you get on get sent to a help desk and someone has an Indian accent. What percentage of the H-1B visa holders come from India?
It's about 70%.
About 70%.
Yeah, and if you break it down into the 65,000 cap, it's probably 85%. Are and I'm doing rough estimates, are from India within that 65,000 cap. It's dominated the program. And
how has that happened?
Well, there are a couple of things that have happened. One is there's been a business model that's been created, an outsourcing business model that's based on the H-1B program. So the goal of these companies, and it's not just Indian-based companies like a Tata or Infosys, but also U.S.-based companies like IBM and Cognizant, and then even other foreign firms like Accenture. And the business model is this. Labor costs in India, skilled labor costs in India are a lot less. So my cousins in India, they may have a degree in engineering or computer science. Their typical wage is going to be about $8,000 to $10,000 a year.
Okay, considerably less than in the U.S.
About a tenth of what a U.S. worker would get. $100,000 is not an unusual salary in the U.S. So there's a big incentive. If you could move the work there, you're going to save on labor costs enormously. It's just the offshoring. It's just like offshoring to China on the manufacturing side for cheap. Apple sends work to Foxconn in China, 60 cents an hour labor. You're moving white collar work there. So that's your ultimate goal.
So the H1B visa worker here from India, who's earning a lot relative to what he'd be earning in India, is a stepping stone ultimately to outsourcing to India?
That's the goal, yeah. And it works in a couple of different ways with the way the H-1B program sort of facilitates it. So some work you can just send offshore, and that's that work's going to go offshore without the H-1B. But a lot of the work requires sort of a lift and shift. It's learning the work, interacting with the client, getting the training from people who are U.S. workers who are already doing the job. Because there's a lot of tacit knowledge. There's a lot of knowledge, unlike a help desk, which you can script out. There's a lot of knowledge in these types of jobs that is tacit, that's only known by the workers, that's accumulated over the years. And the goal is to sort of extract, and it's actually, there's a term of art used in the industry called knowledge transfer.
Okay.
Where a U.S. worker actually trains their replacement, their foreign replacement in this case, to transfer the knowledge.
Now, why would a U.S. worker train their replacement?
Well, the U.S. worker would train their replacement for a couple of reasons. One is if they could easily switch jobs, they would do that instead of the indignity of training their replacement. But the labor market's just not that good, contrary to sort of the conventional wisdom.
Well, I want to revisit that with you, the state of that market.
And then the second piece is that the companies typically will offer an incentive. So they'll give you a severance package. You might have 15, 25 years. I've talked to people who've had 20, 25 years in a company, and they'll offer you, 20 weeks of severance. But if and only if you train your foreign replacement. And so employees are willing to do that because they're not able to find a, good job, and they want to get that severance.
Right. It could take 6 months to find a job that pays at least as well.
Yeah, and what we know from at least the publicly available data, the Displaced Worker Survey, most workers never make the same amount that they used to if they're displaced.
Right.
From any, whether it's because you trained your replacement or your job, the company shut down.
Could we call that a form of blackmail that's used by the employer?
Well, it goes beyond even blackmail in the sense that you also have, it is blackmail, but blackmail with also a gag order, where many of these companies require you to sign essentially gag orders, sometimes called non-disclosure, where you can't talk about the fact that you're being laid off and training your replacement. So this is one of the ways that they've sort of been able to bottle up the news stories from coming out and the like. So it's a horrible experience, and I've talked to lots of workers who've gone through this. Some of those workers, most of those workers are afraid to speak out publicly because either the gag order, but even if they don't have a gag order, like in the case of Disney, they're afraid to speak out because they'll be blacklisted in the industry.
Right. Someone who is a whistleblower, someone who may not be trustworthy,
Yeah, they'll be branded that. And so they're going to have a tough time. And a lot of these workers are in their 30s and 40s and even sometimes 50s. And, there's a lot of age discrimination. It's particularly bad in the technology sector, and a lot of them in that area. The ones I've spoken to have all taken major pay cuts or have dropped out of the industry altogether.
Wow. Wow. So there's very little legal recourse, at least on the surface, very little legal recourse. Let's get back and let's talk about the labor market in more detail, particularly in the IT realm. Now, all these applications are being put in for, these petitions are being approved. You would think that with that kind of volume, you'd see wage inflation in the IT realm where there's just so much demand. I mean, if there's so much demand for these workers, wages have to be accompanying that, just an economic principle. Is that what's going on?
No, and it's not going on. There isn't wage inflation. In fact, we have the objective data that shows that wages have been flat in these same areas, particularly in IT. And the misconceptions are due to a number of factors. But first, just in the way the H-1B program is designed to begin with, employers do not have to show that there's any shortage of U.S. workers. Contrary to what the New York Times has reported, what the Associated Press, both in explainer articles, recent explainer articles, claiming that you have to prove that you don't need American work. You can't find an American worker first. You do not, absolutely do not have to show that. You should. I mean, that should be a requirement, but the government doesn't require that. So you can bypass the U.S. labor market altogether, and you have a strong incentive to bring in H-1Bs because you can legally be paid a lot less. Mm-hmm. And because you as the employer hold a visa, you control that worker, so you have an enormous amount of bargaining power.
In particular, they're from abroad. They probably don't know all the legal options open to them if they are being exploited in some way. Can you give me examples of how these workers are being, has anything come to light in the court system, how workers are being exploited?
Yeah, there's been a number of cases, some that have been reported, but it's quite common, for example, for these firms, especially some of the smaller ones, but even some of the larger ones, to so-called bench their workers. Because of the nature of the work, what they're doing is they're reselling labor to clients, and they don't always have jobs. So if you've ever worked in consulting, you know that you don't have a job all the time. You don't have a steady paycheck.
When I was in the accounting world, we called it being on the beach or on the bench.
Yeah. So it was on the bench is typically what's used here. You're not allowed to do that with the H-1B program. And so there's been a few cases where H-1Bs have come forward and complained to the government, and the Wage and Hour Division and the Labor has gone in and investigated. The reality is you get a little bit of back pay for that. You're taking huge risk, right, by doing it, alienating your employer and so on. And the amount of back pay you get is not much, and it usually takes like 5 years to adjudicate. And so that's the duration of your H-1B. And then, even if you're found against, the employer can come back at you and sue you for liquidated damages. So there's been a couple of very interesting cases like that were profiled by the Center for Investigative Reporting. So your listeners should take a look, do a search on Techsploitation.
Techsploitation.
There's a nice series of articles about all of this. So
and the name of the Center
for Investigative Reporting, it's now called Reveal News. And so you'll sometimes hear them on NPR and whatnot. These are professional journalists who've done really a very nice job of doing a series of stories on it. So, it's a raw deal, not just for U.S. workers. It's a raw deal for these H-1B workers that are being underpaid and exploited.
And it also, I think, beyond the immediate harm, there's a systemic harm. A number of years ago, when I'd mentioned in our pre-interview that I worked for one of the big four accounting firms, and I was at a tax conference, and one of the firms had a large outsource operation going on in India. And they were basically processing state returns and, just filling them out. It's pretty much a compliance deal. And in a session, I had mentioned the problem with that is when you're newly minted accountant out of college and you choose a career in tax, that's how you learn tax, by doing the returns. And then eventually after 10, 12, 15 years, you start doing the provisioning. We start doing the planning and how things could be moved and created in a way that lowers your tax profile. The problem is if you take away that rung, that compliance rung, you're not allowing a whole generation of workers to get that experience that they need to be able to do the really skilled work. That's one of what I see kind of the systemic harm here. When I look at our colleges, where every year we're putting STEM graduates and accounting graduates, all kinds of graduates out there into the job world, and they're competing directly with workers that can be exploited, will typically work for less. What do you think the reaction should be if you're on the board of trustees of a community college or college? Should you be concerned about this?
Well, I think there's a couple of dimensions here. One is the offshoring of this white-collar work, and it's not well known that all of the major accounting firms have huge facilities and are using those early rungs, ladder rungs, and then you've got the IFRS, so there's some regulatory things that are going to actually facilitate the offshoring of that accounting even more. IBM has more workers in India than the U.S. Accenture has more workers in India than the U.S. And the stuff that was easier to send offshore tended to be at the more entry level and at the lower rungs. And so you're going to have this, now it's starting to play out. It's just taken a little while. But we're talking about huge scale. I mean, IBM has probably 130,000, 140,000 workers. They won't in India. They have about 80,000 now in the U.S.
That's a huge impact. Just when you look at, all right, people earn a salary, but money also moves through the economy. It's called the velocity of money. And when you take that money out of the economy altogether, it doesn't have that chance to move the way it has in the past.
Well, and I think that's a reason why you have wage stagnation, and that's why people are upset and don't feel good, even though the unemployment rate at least seems like it's at a good level at 4.4%. People still feel uneasy, right? And I think that explains a lot of sort of the political reaction in the 2016 election towards some of these issues. Now, turning to the H1B side of this, of course, H1B facilitates the offshoring of this work, which doesn't make any sense. Why government? Globalization is going to happen, but should you have government policies that actually push jobs offshore by having these loose H1B rules? The second part is these H1Bs are coming in at really ordinary levels, and they're crowding out Americans. And so we've had a huge increase in the number of Americans who've been studying IT and engineering over the last few years. They're being crowded out by these H1B.
Is that kind of a more of a culture, more of a social Darwinist phenomena going on, where if a shop becomes over 50%, let's say Indian, they will tend to want to hire other Indians?
Well, there are definitely network effects. We know through hiring that this is quite common.
And certainly in the IT world. I was involved in a couple IT startups in the late 90s and early 2000s, and I think everyone that came through our door as a developer of one shade or another, it was a referral from someone who knew someone.
Yeah, and those things happen. And so you've got a number of lawsuits from U.S. workers many of whom who've been displaced, complaining, or who may have worked at some of these large firms, saying that they were discriminated against. In fact, there's a high-profile case going on right now where Infosys, which is one of the major India-based outsourcing firms, where the head of their global immigration services, Aaron Green, he has a discrimination lawsuit against Infosys that they discriminated against anyone who was not South Asian, who wasn't Indian or Pakistani. And you look at the numbers, and I've crunched the numbers, in Infosys or Tata or Cognizant, 99.5% of their H1B workers are from India. So virtually all of their workers on H1Bs are from India, and almost all of their workforce is on H1Bs. That means that almost everybody who's working, and you're talking about not small numbers in the U.S. Infosys probably has about 25,000 workers in the U.S. Almost all of them are Indian. How that passes muster for labor laws and employment discrimination, non-discrimination, boggles my mind.
Can more be done in terms of EEOC enforcing, adding more rigor to these outsourcing companies? Should they be under a lot more scrutiny?
They absolutely should be investigated. I just don't know how any company can have the scale of that workforce and have everybody virtually from India. Just to give you a sense, I mean, Infosys has more workers in the U.S. than Facebook has.
Wow. That's telling.
Imagine if Facebook was all white or all, Chinese or all, Indian.
Right. There'd definitely be a EEOC complaint or two, or 3 or 4 or 5 or 10.
Let alone the discussions on age discrimination.
Right. And certainly there was that email that was published of the woman engineer at Uber and the kind of harassment, sexual harassment and gender harassment that she faced there. Again, it's almost when in a lot of these IT shops, they may not be as well schooled or grounded in the concepts of EEOC and what's required.
Yeah, so I'd make 2 comments there. I mean, one of the problems here is you're basically marrying employment practices from countries like India with the U.S., and they're not always compatible. Mm-hmm. I mean, there's good and bad aspects to both countries in terms of from a worker's perspective. The second piece there, I think it'd be very interesting, and people have tried to get this data, but nobody has it, is gender. We know just sort of anecdotally, and people in the industry, that most of the H1Bs that are coming at least into these IT firms are men. And of course, we already know that there's problems in terms of gender discrimination in the tech industry in the U.S. Well, you're making it worse with the H1Bs. And the most common occupation in the U.S. in terms of women, the highest level women in IT is in computer systems analyst. Mm-hmm. And that's the most common H1B occupation. So you're bringing in a lot of Indian men into an area where you were actually doing pretty well in terms, not great. I mean, you were at 35% according to the government data, but at least you were at 35%, whereas typically in an IT occupation, it's about 20% women. You had 35% 1 and 3. Now you're pushing a lot of those women out.
Wow. Speaking of levels, on the LCA application, there are levels applied to. What are those levels and what do they mean?
Right. So there's 3. So in order to protect both the U.S. workers and foreign workers to ensure that they're being paid a fair wage, right? The company has to go through a process and say, we're going to pay at least what's so-called the prevailing wage. Now, the prevailing wage sounds like market wage, but in reality, it's the government mandate of what the minimum wage is, that you have to pay that particular H-1B worker. That sounds good, right?
Yeah, because you said it's based on the job geographic location.
Right. So the specific job occupation, a computer programmer is different than a software developer, right? Mm-hmm. The geographic location, Silicon Valley is a very expensive, high-cost area. Rochester, New York would be cheaper, so you'd have lower wage levels. And then the third piece, so you get the specific type of job, the geographic location, and the third piece is supposed to be skill level or experience level. And there's 4 wage levels that are supposed to correspond. So level 1 is supposed to be an entry level or intern kind of level, level 2 and 3 and 4. The way they actually determine it, if you imagine kind of a wage distribution like a bell curve.
Okay.
The 17th percentile, so on the bottom side of the bell curve, that's wage level 1, and wage level 2 is 33rd percentile. The wage level 3 is the average, is the median. And then wage level 4 is about 67 percentile. So to make it a little more concrete, I can hire a computer programmer. The government says the prevailing wage for a computer programmer in Knoxville, Tennessee, at wage level 1 is $8 an hour. Now, the other kicker here is the employer gets to decide what the wage levels are.
Oh, okay.
And you might be shocked to learn that 40% of the applications that are approved are for wage level 1. Levels that where the minimum wage is where it's $8 an hour in Knoxville. And just, that's an extreme example, but it's a true one. You'd be approved for that. In Silicon Valley, where you've got super high costs, you're hiring computer people at level 1 at $53,000 a year, right? Which is way below market.
Right, absolutely. You couldn't live. In fact, you'd probably be able to apply for a lot of benefits.
Yeah, so this is one way they game it, and then level 2 is another 40%. So again, you're getting about a 40% discount on.
And the vast majority of these H1B visa holders are levels 1 and 2.
4 out of 5.
4 out of 5. Wow. Now, when you testify before Congress and other bodies, do you give recommendations on how to fix this program? Because the first thing that comes to my mind is, let's just cut levels 1 and 2.
Yeah, so we know a lot about the program, in spite of the propaganda that's come from companies that are making profits off of it, and immigration attorneys who make a lot of money off of more H1Bs is good for the immigration attorneys. We know there's problems, and there's recognized problems, and we know how to fix it. It's very straightforward. It's raising the wage levels. So get rid of levels 1 and 2. If you're bringing in specialized workers, shouldn't they be paid at least the average wage, which is level 3? So that's my first recommendation. I mean, that's the key thing. You got to make this so that the H1B isn't attractive because the worker's cheaper.
Because there has to be, when you look at, again, these college graduates, they get the double whammy of one, having to compete with a foreigner who's probably willing to work for less and is more easily exploitable, less apt to take advantage of the legal system to protect their worker rights. But also, you leave in college with a lot of debt. It's not uncommon for kids to be leaving anywhere from $50,000 to $125,000, maybe even more in debt. So that's another burden that they have to deal with, and another reason why they need to make pretty good wages coming out of college these days.
Yeah, so I mean, it disadvantages, it undercuts American workers. It also harms those foreign guest workers. And remember, they're guest workers, not immigrants, right? This is a non-immigrant work visa, right? Many of them would prefer to be immigrants because they don't have the rights, right? If I'm a H1B worker, even if I'm getting paid, a reasonable wage, and I complain to my boss, they can threaten to terminate me. If they terminate me, I have to leave the country. So there's a huge incentive, there's huge bargaining power that's given to the employer. Now, there is a little bit of portability, but that's a complicated story, and it's not very easy to move around. Mm-hmm. So you don't have those same rights, in addition. Employers have all the advantages here. Workers are at the disadvantage in this program.
Wow. Boy, we've come so far in so many ways, and now we're kind of back to square one.
Look, there's lots of countries that use guest workers. The United Arab Emirates. I was in Dubai a couple of years ago, and it's remarkable. I mean, most of their labor are guest workers. I just don't think you build a prosperous nation, a cohesive country, by using lots of guest workers. We should be using guest workers sparingly. We should be only using it when we really need it. And it's so ripe for exploitation of those guest workers, whether it's on the lower skilled side with the H2B and H2A, or on the higher skilled side, H1B, the L1, and you even have auto plants that are bringing in B1 workers and all kinds of things. So employers have every incentive, and they can rationalize why they're going to exploit these workers, right? And the workers will take it because it's better than their home country. But it's really a race to the bottom when you create this kind of system.
Absolutely. Well, Ron, we're kind of getting close to the end of our time together today. Is there anything that you would like to leave our audience with when it comes to the H1B visa program?
I think the concept of it, that you're going to fill skills gaps is an okay one. I'd prefer to see bringing in permanent folks and training our own folks if there's a real need. But there's a lot of misinformation out there about how the program operates. And this isn't and shouldn't be a partisan thing. This is really about workers' interest in the U.S. economy. And if you think that workers need more rights and need a little support, you should be looking for reforming the system. This is not good. Expanding or the H1B program as it stands right now, it just undercuts not just U.S. workers but also those guest workers.
Oh, fantastic. Well, before we leave today, I want to remind our audience that we have created at Progressives for Immigration Reform, an H1B visa database, so all the LCA data that we discussed for years 2015 and 16, and we're working on getting quarters 1 and 2 for 2017 in there as well. So if you want to search your city, your congressional district, or your zip code and see which applications have been applied for in this program, you can. You can see what the job titles are, what the wages are, either specific to a particular work site and a job or in aggregate. So I really encourage our listeners and viewers to take a look at that site. And Dr. Ron Hira, I want to thank you very much. This was a fantastic interview. I know everyone's going to be much wiser and much wealthier in terms of what they know about this program, thanks to you.
Thanks for the opportunity.